Hey everyone! Today I wanted to take some time to share the process of my most recent illustration. It is the third illustration in a little three-part series I did of some plants. And this last one was, I'm really learning plant names from this. It starts with a Z. It's a zinni plant. It has a more complex name, but I don't think I would be able to pronounce it. And on top of just going over this zinni plant process, because I do like the way it turned out, I just wanted to take the time to document in a little more detail my thoughts about my illustration creation process. And I want to frame it in a way so that I'm talking about things that I did not know when first starting out on Adobe Illustrator a year ago. I think this will provide two great things for people who are also starting out on Illustrator. Maybe you could learn something from this. I'm by no means an expert, but I do think I have learned some stuff since I first started. And the second great thing about this is if you also use Adobe Illustrator and you have tips or ideas for improvement in my process or new things I could try, I would love to hear those from you. So let's start off with reference photos. Of course, I took reference photos of plants. Well, I didn't take the photos, but I used reference photos of plants for all three plants in this series: the cactus, the Swiss cheese plant, and the one that you're seeing right now. I remember in high school and even in early college being somewhat wary of reference photos for a couple of reasons. I think when I was creating art, whether it was traditional or digital, I was worried that I was copying other people or copying someone else's photographic work. And there is some merit to that concern, of course. You don't want to be taking credit for other people's creations, and photography is a form of art. It takes a lot of knowledge and tweaking and preparation and post-editing to produce great photography work. But I think as someone just looking to get some practice drawing or to have some fun, and as long as you're not profiting off of what you're doing, then it might not be as big of an issue. But even then, at that point, there are other options than using someone else's work or work that you're not sure where it was sourced from. Using public domain images is a great way to go. And I've been doing that a lot more recently. I want to say the past 2 to 3 years with my art. I primarily use the website Pexels, and I'll probably throw up a screenshot. That's where I go for my public domain images, and they have a lot of really creative contributors on that site. So if you're worried about it being stock photo-y, you don't have to. There's a lot of great inspiration on there. But overall, reference photos are definitely a good idea. They're great for learning because you don't have this, artistic library in your mind of experience of drawing, whether it's digital or traditional, painting, those things that you're seeing until you actually do it. And you won't get that knowledge to draw upon in your mind without practice, without reference. So this is probably another reason why drawing or creating by looking at something from life or still lifes are so valuable, is because you're getting that practice and you're not directly tracing it. In the case of digital art, that's sometimes the point. So that's where I got this reference photo from. And something else I noticed, at least with Adobe Illustrator in particular, I found a much easier time creating illustrations with reference photos that primarily had organic shapes. So not geometric, not architecture or a lot of flat areas that are solid. And that can work sometimes, and other people, maybe your interests in illustration lean that way, and there's not really a way to avoid that. If you're into maybe typography or other forms of illustration that are more postery, but I think for the kind of illustration I wanted to do, which was more focused on objects or scenery, I found, human anatomy is always hard, so doing faces can be tricky. But things with large surfaces that don't really have textures and are very geometric, they're hard to make not look like just one solid color. And then the alternative is maybe adding a gradient, but even that can be tricky, as I've stated in a different video. So organic shapes are great because you can't tell immediately when you've messed up, or quote, whatever you consider messing up to be. If I'm, making this plant and I make a leaf a little bit wonky, people probably aren't going to notice right off the bat. And if you take that compared to maybe a cityscape scene, the perspective, our eyes are really great at catching mistakes or noticing when perspective is off, noticing when proportions are off. So those could potentially be harder to tackle when first starting out. A second thing that I would like to talk about is more to do with the process of handling a blank canvas on Illustrator. Working from big to small is very important. And I remember watching a YouTube video that another digital artist, they were less into vector art, more into raster. And if you don't know what that means, vector digital art is created through mathematical formulas. So Illustrator is a vector program. All of the lines you draw can scale infinitely large or small, where something like Photoshop or Sci or things that tend to lend themselves more to digital painting, that is a raster graphic program. So they're not using mathematical formulas and equations to create shapes and fill them in with colors. They're using pixels, and it can lose resolution. But anyways, working big to small, digital art, raster, or vector graphic software, it is so easy to get caught up in the details. You can zoom in so far, and you can often forget to zoom out and to look at the composition as a whole. I found myself early on, I would start working on a small segment of the overall thing I wanted to create, and I would just spend hours in that one segment, and I would zoom out and realize, A, I felt like I didn't make a lot of progress as far as filling the canvas space, and B, sometimes those decisions I was making in that small segment, later down the line, I wanted to make a different decision or it wasn't working out. So I now definitely make sure when I'm blocking out my initial shapes that I block out as general as possible. And when I'm doing it, I'm thinking about layering. I'm thinking about what are the main sections of this image? How am I going to split it up? And how am I going to do that in my layers panel? And I get layering and large shapes taken care of first. Even simple illustrations that don't look like they have many shapes, if you actually go into the Illustrator file and look at the layers, I've never even counted. I'm sure the software has something that can show you how many layers you have in a particular file, but I should go check that out because I definitely feel like there's hundreds and hundreds of layers in some of the illustrations I've made. And if you're trying to tackle them at such a small scale, it's I think, at least for myself, it's easier to get too caught up in those small details. One last thing about working from big to small, sometimes you zoom in so far, you're working on details that people aren't even going to be able to see, or tweaking something that people aren't even going to be able to see. It doesn't show up enough, either because of the contrast, or it's just not large enough. So that's just another reason to zoom out more if you can, and to work large to small. In the first video, I brought up on this channel a lot about color. And I struggle with color, but realistic color, to be specific. I love very bright, fun, unrealistic colors, but that's not always what I'm trying to portray. So I always have my swatches on the left side, and The initial swatches that I lay out, even when sampling from a reference image, are almost always too varied. They change too quickly, either in vibrance or hue or whatever the gradient changes I'm trying to make for the blocks of color or shapes that I set out initially. And when I first started Illustrator, once I sampled those color swatches, I almost tied myself down to them. I was like very invested in these color swatches, and they look beautiful and they look nice and organized, but now I know that that is definitely just a starting base. If anything, I only use those color swatches to get vague color estimates and to make it clear to myself when I'm making my initial layers what is layered in front of what, or what shapes are in the back versus the front. And by the time I finish my first pass through of blocking out the major shapes and I start going in and adding detail, colors can completely change. Well, maybe not completely, but they can make some pretty big changes, especially when you're dealing with an image like the one I'm dealing with right now, this plant, where it's primarily green. But of course, there's a lot of different types of greens. Those color changes or those color variations are even more minute and specific and very close to each other. If you tie yourself down too much to those initial color swatches, you trap yourself and you're forcing yourself to commit to these colors that, there's really no reason to. So the alternative being, use them for your layering, and then later, go into the color picker and tweak it there, whether it's the saturation. From what I found is I'm starting to gain, I guess, perception skills on how to make the colors I want. And I think the two biggest factors for me, the first one being saturation, how gray or not gray does it look? And the second one, which I think has been more recently developed, is the hue. So what color is it? So hue being, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, etc. And another way to think of that would be how warm or cool is the color. And that's been more important to me recently because of lighting. So if the cactus is closer to the light source, it's going to have a more yellow looking green, or maybe if it's farther away, it has a cooler looking green because it's not getting that glow of the sun or the lamp or whatever the light source is. Or another way to think of it in the topic of plants, because that's what the set was, is leaves being old or new. So a lot of growth, at least on the Swiss cheese plant and the plant I'm doing now, the newer leaves are a lot more warm toned or vibrant green, where the older leaves are a lot cooler green. So just being aware of those color picking changes when I'm trying to decide what part of the image, what color I need it to be, thinking of it like that instead of, having a little more reason behind what colors I'm picking. Something that I've gotten more skilled at, but am not confident in, is layering. And when I first started Illustrator, I was so overwhelmed, I think, by the number of layers. So some advice there is starting out small, trying to start out with simpler images, and then gradually ramping it up to be more complex. Because one of the first images I ever tried to make in Illustrator was of this dog, and it was my college's mascot. And I avoid animals currently just because the variation in their hair and the lighting, and animals are very complex subject matter to make illustrations of, and I would only do it if maybe it was a commission or something I just particularly really wanted to do and was ready to do. But I guess at the time starting out, I couldn't look at that picture of the dog and break it down and think, oh my gosh, there are so many layers in that image. So really, to make your life easier, I would definitely advise myself, start with simpler images that are less complex, maybe easier to break down into a certain number of layers, and then ramp up from that. A skull series that I did, it was 3 images of skulls. It's up on my Instagram. That was one of the first series of illustrations I did where I was really venturing out and trying to build up layers. And you can tell the first skull was a cat, and then the second one was a dog, and the third one was a rabbit. I got more comfortable and I grew more stamina for how many layers I could handle and how many shapes I could manage in a way that made sense to me, where I wouldn't go crazy, where it wasn't monotonous after a while. And you know, sometimes you've been working on a project for so long, you just kind of want it to be over with. But yeah, building up that stamina with layers definitely took time, but being able to recognize an image and break it down into sections is very important. So I've grown in that category of layers, but what I wanted to touch on is I'm not sure if I'm layering correctly. And what I mean by that is in Adobe Illustrator, there's layers. They're literally called layers, and you can create layers within layers, sub-layers. But then there's something else called groups, where you can select multiple shapes together and group them, and they kind of bundle up in a little, it's similar to a folder, and has a drop-down menu, and you can see what shapes are in that group. And maybe just because no one has ever told me the difference between putting things on a layer versus putting things on a group, I've been using groups a lot. I mean, in some of my documents, I maybe only have 1 or 4 layers, but 20, 30 groups. So it would be interesting if someone had a perspective on that, on what is a efficient use between when to use a group versus when to use a layer. The only intuition I could think of for that reasoning is layers. Whenever you're drawing in Illustrator, there's a color of your pen, essentially. It helps you show what's selected on the screen. And layers, you can decide what color you want that whatever shapes are on that layer to be displayed in. So for this plant I'm drawing, I probably don't want the selected color to be green because it's really hard to see against the art. I'd probably want it to be something that would show up orange, yellow, pink, blue, anything else. You could maybe make the decision to put shapes in layers when they have a similar color palette, but besides that, I mean, that's not a huge motivator as it is. It would be great if someone either confirmed the confusion, or if it's just one of those things where there isn't a right answer and it's just whatever works for your workflow. A final thing I want to touch on is backgrounds. And I have a bad habit with backgrounds. On my Instagram account, I mentioned that I needed to be more conscientious of backgrounds. And it's true. Because almost every time I'll jump right into the illustration, making whatever it is, and I'll forget about the background. And by the time I'm at the end, oh no, it's time to put the background on. The colors are all wonky. Either I created that illustration with the knowledge that the canvas is default set to white, which changes what colors you're going to pick, right? Because when colors are next to each other, your eyes will adjust to accommodate for what those colors look like or mean. And by the time you stick a background on, it's very difficult, at least for me, to find a color matched background that I like. That's something that ideally I would decide up front and do that first, along with the other base color swatches. Of course, you can change it later, but just to make sure everything is on the same page as, okay, what background color are we in reference to for the brightness of the image that we're going to be putting on top of this background. Near the end of this video, you'll see that I was trying to do a purplish color, and that wasn't really working out. And eventually I just gave up and picked a really pale light blue because that was very close to white and the colors worked on top of that. And I remember being in AP Studio Art in high school, my teacher, Miss Riley, Cindy Riley, that was something that she taught us. She said, do your backgrounds first. They're important. Your art looks better when you do your backgrounds first. And I should listen to her. So I always tell myself this, but it's true. I'm trying. I gotta be more conscientious of my backgrounds. A final thing I want to touch on is backgrounds. And I have a bad habit with backgrounds. On my Instagram account, I mentioned that I needed to be more conscientious of backgrounds. And it's true. Because almost every time I'll jump right into the illustration, making whatever it is, and I'll forget about the background. And by the time I'm at the end, oh no, it's time to put the background on. The colors are all wonky. Either I created that illustration with the knowledge that the canvas is default set to white, which changes what colors you're going to pick, right? Because when colors are next to each other, your eyes will adjust to accommodate for what those colors look like or mean. And by the time you stick a background on, it's very difficult, at least for me, to find a color matched background that I like. That's something that ideally I would decide up front and do that first, along with the other base color swatches. Of course, you can change it later, but just to make sure everything is on the same page as, okay, what background color are we in reference to for the brightness of the image that we're going to be putting on top of this background. Near the end of this video, you'll see that I was trying to do a purplish color, and that wasn't really working out. And eventually I just gave up and picked a really pale light blue because that was very close to white and the colors worked on top of that. And I remember being in AP Studio Art in high school, my teacher, Miss Riley, Cindy Riley, that was something that she taught us. She said, do your backgrounds first. They're important. Your art looks better when you do your backgrounds first. And I should listen to her. So I always tell myself this, but it's true. I'm trying. I got to be more conscientious of my backgrounds. Anyways, those were some things that I think I've learned since I first started Illustrator. I'm still working on some of them. Like the layers one, I have an idea, but not the idea for what really works for me or what I think is best. But that's okay, because I'm going to keep learning and creating things, and that's what the whole point of this is. So thank you for watching. If you like this plant series, go ahead and visit me on Instagram at lunaceros.art, and you can see more like that, as well as that skull series that I mentioned. Another note is I am open for commissions. So if you want to have a discussion about creating a piece or an illustration, me creating an illustration for you as a gift that you want to give to someone, or something to print on merchandise, stickers, phone wallpapers, a print to hang and frame where you live, a birthday card, an e-birthday card. Illustration is very versatile, and I can work off reference photos, or if you have an inspo board of designs that you like or a vibe that you're going for, that works as well. If that's something you're interested in, just message me on my Instagram account, or you can email me at lunaceros.connect@gmail.com, and we can talk about it. Thanks for watching.